I'm Niko Kolodny. I'm the current chair of the department, but also, as it happens, a former student of Barry's. And so on behalf of the department, I'd like to welcome you all and to thank you all for coming today. It's been profoundly moving and consoling to see so many of Barry's students and colleagues and friends here today, many of whom have come great distances and others who have come shorter distances but with great difficulty. I've been personally overwhelmed, as I know that Sarah and Julie and Martha have been, by all of the contributions that have been volunteered to make this memorial possible. So I'm thinking of Janet Groom and Dave Linnott tracking down former students to invite, Maura and Catherine clearing out the old chair's office, Jay for meeting with contractors to plan its transformation into the Stroud Room, Aude for making the Stroud Room plaque, John for affixing it to the door, to Tony, who is doing all of the food and drink, which we'll be enjoying later today. And he's still hard at work in Howison, prepping everything. And I should also thank my wife, who's there helping him. And also thanks to all of the speakers who agreed to give their remarks today. So thanks to Antonia and to Dick and to Jason and to Sam and Sarah and Tom, and also to Ronnie, who prepared the remarks, although he won't be able to give them because he's recovering from an operation, but Barry's nephew, Richard, will be giving Ronnie's remarks in his absence. Of course, Francesca, for Barry's granddaughter, for those of you who don't already know, who just played so wonderfully for us. And lastly, to Janet Broughton for all of her sage advice throughout the planning of this memorial. So philosophy is a curious subject. You have to commit to doing it for several years before you begin to understand what it is that you've been trying to do. And for me, I don't think I realized, really understood what it was that I had been trying to do until well into my pursuit of a PhD here at Berkeley, when I took a seminar that Barry taught on the reality of color. And it was then for the first time that I really began to feel that I understood what it was that we were trying to do. And that was by watching Barry. So he was a model of philosophical inquiry, his patient insistence that we had to clarify what the question was that we were trying to answer, and then also to get clear on what it would take to answer it. What would a solution to the problem that we had posed to ourselves actually require? And the Stroudian lesson, time and again, was that if you really got clear about the question you were asking and about what it would take to answer that question, you'd see that you couldn't answer that question to your own satisfaction, at least in the terms that you felt nevertheless compelled to ask it. And so I was put in mind of this Stroudian lesson once again as I took up the task, which fell to me as the current spokesperson of the department, to speak to the question of what, in particular, Barry contributed to Berkeley philosophy. So what was his specific legacy? And as I tried to draw up a list of his various contributions to the department, I found that I just wasn't making any headway. And then I stepped back and asked myself, oh, what is the question that I'm trying to answer, and what would it really take to answer it? And when I did, I realized that I couldn't answer it to my satisfaction, at least not in the terms that I nevertheless felt compelled to ask it. And that was because answering the question, what did Barry contribute to Berkeley philosophy, would require that somehow you could identify or keep track of this thing, Berkeley philosophy, in one's mind's eye, while imagining it without Barry. So you could somehow take the difference of Berkeley philosophy as it is now, less what it would have been without Barry. And that's what I found I just couldn't do. So this imagined Berkeley philosophy without Barry just kept disappearing from view. I mean, to be sure, there was a sign over the door, there was letterhead, there was a space in the catalog after Persian and before physics. And they all bore the name, Department of Philosophy, University of California, Berkeley. But the things that really mattered, the people, these people, and the shared understanding of what it was that we were trying to do together, that's what I just couldn't imagine without Barry.
Hi, I'm Richard Stroud, and I'm Barry's nephew. And my father, Ronald Stroud, Barry's older brother, was supposed to speak today. But like he said, he's recovering from hip surgery and doing very well, but just can't make it. So these are his words that I'm going to read today. Barry Stroud. In one of his most notorious poems, Philip Larkin once complained, "They fuck you up, your mom and dad." This did not happen to the Stroud boys growing up in Toronto, Canada in the 1940s and 50s. Barry and I were lucky enough to have the most loving and supportive parents you could imagine. Neither of them had finished high school, and it might have seemed strange to them that their sons in their late teens stayed up late at night puzzling over the theories of David Hume or wrestling with the syntax of Thucydides in ancient Greek. Barry knew Larkin's poems well, and in the autobiographical section of his Dewey Lecture of 2008, he offered the following eloquent refutation. As for my own past, I started out with the good fortune of having parents who were completely supportive of my doing anything I wanted to. They never raised the question, what are you going to do in life? Or, why don't you do so-and-so, or become such and such? Or, why on earth are you doing that? What are you going to do to get out of that? Never. And not because they were not interested or didn't care what I did. It was because they did care, and they knew how to let me do it. They trusted me and believed in me without imposing conditions or demands of their own, or were so good at it that I didn't feel them. In any case, I felt no pressure and there was no rush. Barry and I grew up in Barry's small bungalow in Toronto with a tiny bedroom fitted out with bunk beds. We spent a lot of time together as young boys, and I had the opportunity of seeing what a remarkably versatile person he turned out to be. In addition to growing into a world-class creative philosopher and beloved teacher, Barry learned firsthand all about farming in his summer vacations, and he was driving a tractor in his early teens. He spent 5 summers as a lineman for the Canadian National Telegraph Company, climbing poles and stringing wire in remote railway towns in Ontario. His athletic career in football and basketball at high school and the University of Toronto was dazzling. The name of Barry Stroud was often in the headlines of the sporting pages of Toronto daily newspapers. While all this was going on, he taught himself one of the most difficult of all sports. He was a scratch golfer, and at least 2 occasions when I played with him, he broke 70. Among many memories, I remember that Barry could sometimes be a stickler for details, for getting it right. He also had an uncanny sense of timing for exactly the right word on the right occasion. In his last days, in our family conversations around his bed, when we thought that he was asleep, he would often come up with the correct name or date after none of us could remember it, sometimes with just a single word. Also, in singing my brother's praises at the celebration of his 80th birthday, I noted that as a starting point guard for the varsity basketball team at the University of Toronto, he had scored 30 points in a single game. This was in an era when the scores of many college basketball games, particularly in Canada, were in the 50s and 60s. Across the room, I could see that Barry was frowning. He looked as if he wanted to say something, so I paused, and he quickly interjected, 31. On another public occasion familiar to some of you, Barry's sense of timing and brevity was memorable. At the conclusion of Barry's faculty research lecture, the chancellor made what can sometimes be a fatal error at Berkeley. He asked for questions from the audience after a scholarly talk. Sure enough, an older woman in the front row immediately leapt to her feet and delivered a speech that lasted several minutes. At the end, she challenged Barry, asking if he would care to respond to her argument. His curt reply was welcomed by the audience and quickly brought the proceedings to a close. No. I had the good fortune to be with my brother almost up until the end. He was calm, without pain, and without distress. He died in his own home, in his own study, in fact, surrounded by his books and under the loving care of his twin daughters, Martha and Julie, of course, older daughter Sarah, and his wonderful caregivers, Anna and Rob. He had many visitors and was in contact with friends in the United States and Europe. He even had a meal cooked for him in his own home by his favorite Italian chef. Barry did not formally study Latin, but I do not think that he would object if I closed today by addressing Frater Meus with the final greeting, Ave atque vale. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dick Ryerson, and I'm a 180. I first met Barry and Ronnie in high school. We played football and basketball together. Barry, as said before, was our quarterback and an all-star basketball player. First, I would like to thank Julie and Martha and Sarah for choosing me to give my relationship to Barry here today. Secondly, I'd like to thank the university philosophy department for designating a special room on his honor. Thank you. Barry and I had different journeys from high school. Barry came to University of California we both came in 1961. And Barry came with a PhD in hand from Harvard University and ready to teach at the University of California. I arrived also in 1961, and I had just completed a year of ski bumming in Colorado. And I had no idea what I was going to do when I got to San Francisco. Shortly after Barry was diagnosed, Patty, my wife and I, came to Berkeley to see him. When we arrived, we met Dr. Tom Nagel. And during our conversation, Dr. Nagel asked me, he said, "Are you an academic also? I says, no, Dr. Nagel. I says, I'm a 180. He looked a little puzzled and says, well, what's a 180? I says, well, a 180 is a person who is about 180 degrees from being an academic. Aside from being 180 degree, Barry and I developed a very close relationship. We backpacked together, we played golf, we shot pool. Well, in Canada they call it snooker. And we devoured many cases of Italian wine together. Patty and I spent many weeks in Italy, in Venice, Rome, and Umbria with Barry. I was particularly fantastic to see Sarah, Martha, and Julie from diaper stage to the lovely ladies they are today. And that relationship even grew in the last few months. One of Barry's favorite passions was food. And his favorite dinner was fegato di Venezia. Now, that sounds exotic, but it's just simply liver and onions, Venetian style. Patty and I would host a dinner probably every 6 to 8 weeks for over 20 years. Barry would show up. We would slice the yellow onions, bathe them in Umbrian olive oil, and put them in the skillet while we polished off a bottle of Prosecco. As soon as the Prosecco was drained from our glasses, Barry would jump up and run to the kitchen and start cutting the liver. He insisted on having a very sharp knife, which I honed the day before. And I could never figure out why he needed a sharp knife to cut liver. But he did, and I didn't ask why. So he would very fastidiously cut the liver into bite-sized pieces. And I could hear a groan every so often if the cut was too small a bite or too big a bite. It had to be perfect. Then when it was all cut, he would push the onions to one side of the skillet and add the liver. The liver would be probably 20 seconds finished. He would mix it all together. Then he would spoon it all over creamy polenta that Patty just took off the stove. At that point, it magically became fegato di Venezia. And that was followed by a bottle of Barolo or Sagrantino wine and a couple of hours of wonderful conversation. I think we'll miss that more than anything. Another of Barry's passions, was early Italian art by Bellini and Titian and other Venetian masters. When Patty and I would go to Venice, Barry would circle us through these beautiful churches to see this marvelous art all day long. One night, going for dinner in Venice, about probably half a mile from Barry's apartment, it was a beautiful autumn evening, not a cloud in the sky. After our 2 or 3 hour dinner, we were exiting the restaurant probably around midnight, and we encountered a huge torrential downpour. We had no umbrella, we had no raincoats, but the quarterback huddled us up in the doorway and says, okay, now, this is what we gotta do. So he started barking all the plays. He says, we'll run down here about 100 yards, turn right, he says, and then there's a little bridge connecting 2 buildings. We get into that, catch our breath. So while we were catching our breath, he was barking the next order. Okay, Now we run along the canal till we get to the piazza. Turn left, there's an umbrella there. The street vendor uses during the day. Catch our breath there. That worked. Everything worked. I was amazed that he knew every inch of Venice. I mean, there wasn't anything. I think from his long strolls through Venice over the years, while he was there writing books, he knew every nook and cranny. Well, these sprints went on, 100 yards at a time, and by the time we got back to his apartment, we were laughing so hard we could hardly stand up. We were so soaked. We could have strolled back and got just as wet. We were laughing so hard we could hardly climb the stairs to his apartment. Just another wonderful night, wonderful day with Barry. A couple of months ago, I think, I was in contact with Martha every day. She was in charge of communications. Julie was in charge of the organization. As everyone here knows, they did an absolute fantastic job. Well, Martha says, well, Dad's getting weaker. He's sleeping more every day. So I thought I should call Ronnie and we should meet over there together. That way we can talk while Barry can listen, go sleep in and out. And we did. We met 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And we went in and we sat down and we greeted Barry, and he was very, very quiet. We started talking about old EYCI, East York Collegiate Institute, the wonderful high school we all attended in Toronto. We were talking about events and classmates and teachers, and the conversation eventually got to football. And I asked Ronnie, I said, Ronnie, do you remember that old show-off play? Barry's eyes popped wide open. He says, that was called Spread Right. So he says, I would pick up the ball from the center. Of course, I said before, he was the quarterback. He had to start the play. He says, I would pick up the ball from the center, and he says, arm went up. He says, I would throw it out into the right flat. He says, but also, his was a left. He says, we had a left flank too. He says, I would throw it into the left flat. He got so excited, I expected his left arm to come up and ward off tacklers, and then jump out of bed and start running interference. He was totally excited. And Ronnie and I had probably the greatest hour or two we could have had. A couple of days later, Barry passed away. I will miss him more than anything. I really loved the guy. Thank you.
So I first met Barry in December of 1976 at a hotel in Boston where the Eastern Division meetings of the American Philosophical Association were being held. I was a graduate student at Princeton, and Barry and three of his colleagues, Tom Clark, Bill Craig, and Linda Foy, interviewed me for a job at Berkeley. I was writing a dissertation in ethics, and when it came to ethics, Berkeley was something of a backwater in those days. When I was eventually offered the job, for example, the department chair told me that he hoped I would accept because it would be good for the graduate students to have someone on the faculty who specialized in Eastern political philosophy, as he called it. It took me a moment to realize that he was referring to the East Coast of the United States rather than to Asia, and to Rawls and Nozick rather than, say, to Gandhi or Mao. Under the circumstances, it wouldn't have been unreasonable for me to wonder, going into the convention interview, how stimulating the discussion was likely to be. In fact, it turned out to be one of the most rewarding philosophical conversations I'd ever had. From the moment I sat down, Barry and his colleagues began to discuss my ideas with me, zeroing in instantly on the most central issues and raising deep and fundamental questions. The fact that none of them was a specialist in ethics was irrelevant. They were philosophers whose minds were not organized into areas of specialization, and what they wanted to talk to me about was the philosophical substance of my work. They didn't interrogate me or try to trip me up or present me with ingenious counterexamples. And if you hadn't known that it was a job interview, you probably wouldn't have guessed it from listening to the discussion. We were simply a group of people talking about philosophy. And for me at least, the discussion was exhilarating. The substance of it stayed with me for a long time. In fact, a book I published 15 years later was largely an attempt to answer a question Barry asked me at that interview. But although it took me 15 years to answer Barry's question, there was one thing I knew before I walked out of the hotel room where the interview took place. I knew that Berkeley was where I wanted to be, ethical backwater or not. Luckily for me, I got the chance, and I arrived in Berkeley in the fall of 1977. Barry was away on leave that year, so we didn't really get to know each other until the following year. But once he returned, we became friends almost immediately, and we remained friends until his death. As a friend, Barry was loyal, steadfast, and a great deal of fun to be with. His sharp wit, perceptiveness and intelligence, and wide-ranging interests made him a wonderful conversationalist and extremely good company. In the early years especially, when each of us was living on our own, we spent a great deal of time together, and I have many wonderful memories of meals at now defunct restaurants, of movies in Berkeley and San Francisco, of long conversations about everything under the sun, and it must be said, of a shocking number of martinis. As the years went by, life changed in many ways for both of us, but our friendship remained a constant. After I eventually moved to New York, we met in person only on occasional visits, but we continued to talk regularly on the phone, and the things that we shared and our strong sense of being on the same wavelength never changed, so that each phone call seemed like the resumption of one long conversation that had merely been interrupted. We would normally end those phone calls by sighing and agreeing that things just weren't the way they had been in the good old days. Each of us forbearing to point out that we had said much the same thing in the good old days. Of course, Barry was not only a friend, but for 3 decades a colleague, and he was every bit as good a colleague as he was a friend. It wasn't just that he had excellent judgment about departmental matters, though that was certainly true, nor was it just that he could be counted on to complete any assigned task or fill any departmental administrative role with distinction, though that too was true. It was also because his practical judgment and competence were combined with and leavened by an acute sense of the absurdity of bureaucratic rules and procedures, even or especially within a university setting. For instance, Barry liked to tell the following story. When he was department chair, he organized a retirement dinner for Paul Grice at Narcy's restaurant in Colusa Circle, which, as a few of you may remember, was one of the very best local restaurants at the time. As the result of a contribution from a private donor, the department had some unrestricted funds available to it, and Barry wanted to use some of that money to pay for the wine that had been consumed at the dinner. The administrative authorities, however, refused to authorize the payment because under campus rules, it exceeded the maximum allowable expenditure for alcohol. Barry kept writing letters reiterating his request to have the payment authorized and giving reasons why it should be allowed. He mentioned again and again such things as the unrestricted nature of the funds, the fact of Grice's great distinction, the department's much appreciated and morale-enhancing tradition of marking the retirement of colleagues with an especially nice dinner, and so on. Again and again, his request was denied. Eventually, he telephoned the person in charge, who after an extended discussion said, "Oh, is what you're saying that you're asking for an exception to the rule?" Barry said, "Yes, of course that's what he was saying." "Oh, that's fine then," came the reply. "Just right, I request an exception on the form and resubmit it." And as soon as Barry did that, the request was immediately approved. To Barry, this summed up perfectly the absurdity of a certain rule-bound administrative mindset. Even the recognition that there might sometimes be good reasons for making exceptions to the rules and not applying them too rigidly was itself turned into a rigid rule. What mattered wasn't the reason for the exception, it was just that one ticked a box labeled exception. Barry's dislike of anything that smacked of bureaucracy or rule-bound behavior was close cousin to his dislike of academic professionalism. He particularly disliked the highly professionalized version of academic philosophy that appeared to him to be in the ascendancy. He disliked the narrowness of its questions and of its answers, its overvaluation of the superficial trappings of achievement or progress, its lack of fidelity to, and indeed lack of curiosity about, the distinctive character of philosophical inquiry, and its conceit that philosophy can be divided into separate areas of specialization, each with its own cadre of experts. Barry told the story of attending an APA convention with Tom Clark, whose alienation from the professional dimensions of academic life exceeded even Barry's own, and of the two of them suddenly being struck by the preposterousness of the very idea of a convention of philosophers. "Do artists have conventions?" Barry delightedly reported Tom as having asked. I would be remiss if I failed to say that I considered Barry not only a friend and a colleague, but also a teacher. I was never formally his student, and although we did discuss philosophical issues many times and in many contexts, the most important philosophical lessons I learned from him were more general than any one of those conversations. They had to do with the attitude toward philosophy that he manifested in everything he said about the subject, and indeed in many of the things he said about other subjects. I learned a lot from him about the distinctiveness of philosophical questions. I learned to be faithful to those questions while not assuming they could ultimately be answered in a way that would satisfy the desire for understanding they expressed. I learned about the need for patience in philosophical reflection and about its difficulty. And I learned to approach philosophical solutions and theories, however ingenious, with a default attitude of engaged mistrust. In one of the obituaries published after Barry's death, Niko was quoted as saying that Barry was a philosopher's philosopher. He meant, of course, that Barry represented philosophical inquiry in its purest form, and that is true. But the phrase might also be misinterpreted and taken to mean just the opposite of what Niko intended. It might be taken to mean that Barry was the kind of highly professionalized philosopher whose concerns were shared only by other highly professionalized philosophers. To forestall such a misinterpretation, it might be best simply to say that what Barry was at his core was a philosopher. Not a professor of philosophy, not a member of the philosophical profession, not a specialist in epistemology or any other area of philosophy, but a philosopher. Barry thought there weren't nearly enough philosophers in philosophy departments, and perhaps he was right about that. But Barry was certainly a philosopher himself, an exceptionally deep and wide-ranging philosopher, and that fact shone through in everything he did. It's what made an impression on me in that Boston hotel room in December of 1976, and it's the reason why, for so many of us, he represented everything that was best about the Berkeley department for over half a century. So farewell to you, Barry, friend, colleague, teacher, philosopher. I'm grateful to have known you, and I miss you. Now, alas, things really won't be like they were in the good old days.
Hi. My name is Antonia Peacocke, and Barry was one of my advisors when I was a graduate student here from 2012 to 2018. Barry had a distinctive way of doing philosophy. The clarity of his thought, the honesty of his methods, and his commitment to asking the most fundamental questions he could think of asking all come out in everything that he has written down. But today I want to talk about Barry as a teacher. His way of teaching had a lot in common with his way of writing. It was as direct as it could be. He was always quite simply the philosopher that he was in every interaction that you had with him. Nothing was a mere exercise. Barry never gave out a recipe for doing good philosophy, and he didn't impose any structure on the way his students thought. He simply demonstrated very plainly what he was doing and invited us to do as he did. He said what he thought and why he thought it. Then we all got the idea that that was the thing to do, and we tried to do it. It's not as easy as it sounds. Barry would do something unusual in his undergraduate classes. He would choose a paper from a set of student papers, black out the name, copy it, and hand around the text to everyone in the room. We would read it out loud together and discuss it. This was student work, imperfect and stumbling. The first time Barry did this for any course, you could feel embarrassment snaking through the room. The first student's comments might be snarky or nervous or ironic, but Barry would patiently wait for this awkwardness to wear off. Over the course of the semester, people started to see that everything that they said counted, and the papers got better. When you went to meet him in his office, Barry would set his desk chair in the middle of a blank space of floor and set another chair a few feet away from him so that there was nothing in between you at all. He would listen carefully to what you said, and sometimes he would let the room hang in silence for several moments as he looked out the window and thought about what to say back. He would take his time, and gradually you would learn to take your own time too. Conversations with Barry were some of the best philosophical discussions you could ever have. He was a fundamentally sincere philosopher who tackled the hardest questions he could find. Since leaving Berkeley a little over a year ago, I've realized what a rare and special thing that really is. At first, I wanted to express my point just like this. Barry saw the absolute impossibility of escaping from your own perspective, and he must have decided at some point to completely inhabit his own. But then I thought about what Barry might say about this very statement. What other perspective did you expect me to inhabit? Maybe it will be easier to express what I mean by saying what Barry didn't do. So let me try that. Contemporary philosophy can sometimes feel like an exhibition game. There are questions certain key players have asked, and these set the terms of the game. One way to win a point is simply to think of an answer to the question that nobody has given before. If someone asks you a question about your answer and you don't have a reply, they win a point. But if you have an answer, you win another point for yourself. Whoever has the most points wins in the end. Barry never played this game. For starters, he never took it as a reason to think about something, that some influential philosopher had thought about that thing before. I'll admit that this became stressful at times. Sometimes he wouldn't know why I was taking a certain line in conversation. I would mumble that some people in the literature said X, so I should know what to say about X. He would look at me like he was concerned for my health. Barry also knew that sometimes there is simply nothing more you can say to show someone why something is so. But you don't lose a point when this happens. Sometimes this is simply the situation in which you find yourself, and it is not a position of weakness. On the contrary, this position has its own kind of strength. We can discover some of the most fundamental aspects of the way that we think by finding that at certain points, there's nothing additional to say in favor of a belief that we have. It is just something we cannot give up. There weren't ways to win points with Barry. He simply refused to play philosophy as a game. And because he refused to do that, he protected the beating heart of philosophy, a practice of uncompromisingly genuine, mortifyingly earnest, and invariably difficult inquiry into the things that are most puzzling to us as human beings. I think that philosophers everywhere can honor Barry's memory by continuing to protect this beating heart of philosophy, and I hope that we will all do that for a long time to come. For now, I'd just like to thank Barry for all that he has done for me, all that he has done for all of his students, and all that he has done for philosophy as a whole, and to thank his family and the department here at Berkeley for organizing the celebration of his remarkable life. Thank you.
My name is Jason Bridges, and it would make sense for me to start with a couple minutes talking about Barry as a philosopher, and then a couple minutes talking about Barry in the rest of life, because I knew him first as a teacher and then as a friend. But I find that I can't proceed in that way in thinking about and talking about him. I can't partition my thought about Barry into two different spheres. For me, there isn't Barry the philosopher and Barry the everything else, there's just Barry. I mean, saying that, I may make it sound like I'm saying that he was only interested in philosophy, as if he walked around with his head in the clouds, just cogitating exclusively about the deepest issues of life. And you know from Dick's remarks and other people that that's definitely not true about him. I myself, outside of academic contexts, spent at least as much time talking about him with jazz as philosophy, which he loved. Most recently, in June, he was regaling me with stories about seeing Sonny Rollins in his prime in the late 50s. Although it's true that Barry knew that I loved Sonny Rollins, I actually named my son's middle name Sonny after Sonny Rollins, so he could have just been messing with me. It worked. I was kind of pissed. But I mean, he had many interests and loves. Above all, his family, Sarah and Martha and Julie, and his brother and his brother's family and his friends. And in terms of interests, not just music, sports, as we've heard, and art and food and travel, Venice, and many, many things. A broad person. What I mean is that, to me, in saying that I can't separate Barry the philosopher from Barry the person, I mean the spirit that animates his philosophical work, that gives it its distinctive power and savor, also animated the way he lived his life and gave all interactions with Barry a distinctive meaning and savor. So what is that spirit? I would say it's a spirit of being fully clear on what matters to one, on what one values, on what one finds worth pursuing, and then proceeding accordingly. You know, so always having as vivid a conception as possible of what one values as one's end, and intelligibly, productively organizing one's actions in pursuit of that end. In person, Barry, in his manner, in the cadence and content of his speech, there is a distinctive calmness to him. And I would say it was a calmness of somebody who at once both didn't waste time and took his time. Right? So he didn't waste time because he had no energy or space for pursuing things that he could not see the point of. Many of us, most of us, spend a lot of time on commitments that we have half-heartedly or provisionally, or just in virtue of forces in ourselves or out there that we don't understand. Not so much Barry, but also taking his time, because the point was not just to achieve and to experience for the sake of achieving and experiencing. The point for him was the value of what one was after, what one was experiencing. And so to understand that value and to know how to go about acquiring it. And so if that would take time, if that would take slow, patient effort, then that was how it had to be with him. There was also no BS, or little to no BS with Barry. He was really bad at faking interest in something that he did not think was worth his time. We students, they might have wished it was a little bit different, maybe just a soupçon of BS to let the medicine go down easier. But that wasn't his way. Not that he was mean-spirited or anything like that, but his way was different. His way was to try to help you to see where the real value in inquiry lay. To try to get you to stop barking up the tree where there was no fruit, as he saw it, and look where the real riches were, as gently as he knew how to do. So I've been saying that the spirit of Barry is being clear on what you're after and then proceeding to achieve it. In philosophy, of course, it's a form of inquiry. So what one is after, one is trying to achieve, is a kind of understanding or illumination. So that commitment translates into that context, to trying to be as clear as possible as what you're going to understand, what you're after, what is the nature of the question you're asking, as Niko put it so well, and Antonia. What kind of understanding do we want? What will satisfy us? But the thing is that for Barry, as has also been mentioned, in philosophy, there's a special danger that arises just at that moment. There's an elusiveness to the understanding that we're after in philosophy. Niko, could you grab that? And so, for him, thank you very much, there is a danger that we would lose our way. The deepest philosophical question for him was, perhaps, what are we after when we're doing philosophy? What are we trying to understand? And if we didn't keep that question in view, then we would never achieve the kind of intellectual advance or peace or whatever it was that we were after. This explains, among other things, this conviction, this insight explains his style, which was patient. Even there was a gravity to it. This made it very much out of step, as Sam mentioned, with at least one characteristic style of contemporary analytic philosophy, with its brisk pace and its interest in really complex taxonomies of different kinds of views, and its conviction that whatever we think we can translate into the semantics of some logical system, some artificial logical system, without losing anything in the process. It's also out of step with a typical trend, a tendency in continental philosophy, where works of the past are seen not as useful or instructive contributions by fellow travelers on some shared quest of understanding, but rather as monuments, as things to revere or to try to decipher or just to burn down. And Barry's writings are exemplary of a different way to proceed. Not facile, not portentous, just honest and plain with a degree of elegance, trying to honor and take stock of what he thought of as the fundamental strangeness of the philosophical enterprise. So I'll end with just one further thought. It's a hypothesis about him. I don't know if it's true, which is that part of what attracted him, maybe most of what attracted him to philosophy, was just that elusive character of philosophical understanding. I mean, that might seem kind of strange. It might seem to conflict with what I've been saying. You know, if your mode of life is the pursuit of clarity, this clarity of purpose, then why would you be attracted? Why would you spend so much time on a subject where it's so hard to come by? Well, if your mode of life is clarity of purpose, then where better to exert your energies and your efforts than in a field where it's so hard to come by? And so if it's achieved, that is so much to be treasured. And he did, I think, achieve it. And so of all the many things, the many ways in which I feel lucky to have known him, I would say above all is this distinctive kind of integrity, this clarity of purpose, that, and what it meant to those of us who knew him both inside philosophy and outside of philosophy. And that's the thing of all that I feel luckiest. Thanks.
In place of readings from poetry or scripture, I want to read passages from the writings of two philosophers whom Barry admired greatly. The first is the 18th century philosopher David Hume. In an early work, A Treatise of Human Nature, he described the experience of philosophical inquiry in terms that I think capture much of what was special about Barry's cast of mind. Here's Hume. When it is asked, what is the nature of all our reasonings concerning matters of fact, the proper answer seems to be that they are founded on the relation of cause and effect. When again it is asked, what is the foundation of all our reasonings and conclusions concerning that relation, it may be replied in one word, experience. But if we still carry on our sifting humor and ask, what is the foundation of all conclusions from experience? This implies a new question which may be of more difficult solution and explication. Philosophers that give themselves airs of superior wisdom and sufficiency have a hard task when they encounter persons of inquisitive dispositions who push them from every corner into which they retreat and who are sure at last to bring them to some dangerous dilemma. The best expedient to prevent this confusion is to be modest in our pretensions and even to discover the difficulty ourselves before it is objected to us. By this means, we may make a kind of merit of our ignorance. Recognizing that there's a further question to ask, pushing against the philosophers who give themselves airs of sufficiency, these general tendencies drove many of Barry's remarkable philosophical achievements. I think it is also true to say that Barry spoke for the cause of philosophical modesty, though that does not convey how exhilarating it could be to understand exactly what he advocated there and why. In later years, Hume wrote an essay in the character of someone he called the skeptic, assigning to this character a disposition that was in many ways his own. While Barry's disposition was not quite Hume's, I do feel I recognize Barry in the final paragraph of the essay. And before I read this passage, I should explain the 18th century meaning of two words. You are careless about something if you don't care about it, and something is amusing if it engages your mind in a way that pleases you. So here is the skeptic. Human life is more governed by fortune than by reason, and is more influenced by particular humors than by general principles. Shall we engage ourselves in life with anxiety? It is not worthy of so much concern. So, shall we be indifferent about what happens? We would lose all the pleasure of the game by our carelessness. To reduce life to exact rule and method is commonly a painful, oft a fruitless occupation. And is it not also a proof that we overvalue the prize for which we contend? Even to reason so carefully concerning it, and to fix with accuracy its just idea, would be overvaluing it, were it not that to some tempers, this occupation is one of the most amusing in which life could possibly be employed. The third reading is very brief, from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. In his final weeks, Barry spoke often of Kant's insight into the basic and natural mistake that can lead us astray in philosophy, the mistake of thinking that we can philosophize independently from considering what makes human experience possible. And this short passage distills what I think Barry was responding to in Kant. The light dove, cleaving the air in her free flight and feeling its resistance, might imagine that her flight would be easier still if she could fly through empty space.
Barry and I got to know each other in 1960 to 61, his last year in the philosophy graduate program at Harvard and my first. He then took a job at Berkeley, and I followed him in 1963. I moved back east to Princeton in 1966, but for 3 years, we were colleagues in that unique condition of subordinate equality that brings people so close together. We were present at the beginning of a transformation of the Berkeley Philosophy Department. Most of its tenured members, as I recall, were Berkeley PhDs, far removed from current developments in analytic philosophy. Barry and I found an inexhaustible supply of things to deplore about how the department was being run in our almost daily conspiratorial lunches. It should have been obvious that we and our ilk were destined to take over, but at the time we felt like the oppressed proletariat, and no doubt enjoyed it hugely. Leaving Barry was for me one of the saddest things about leaving Berkeley. But as it turned out, our friendship was an enduring part of my life. We didn't correspond regularly, but although we saw each other only at unpredictable intervals, our connection when we met was immediate and always the same. We were infallibly on the same wavelength. We shared a view of philosophy that was a minority position even when we were young, and that has become more unfashionable over the years since then. A view influenced by Wittgenstein, though less radical than the conception found in his later work, so far as I understand it. It is the view that the center of philosophy, its deepest and most interesting part, consists of certain philosophical problems that are different in kind from those in any other domain of thought. These problems are probably not soluble, but they are irresistible, and the attempt to solve them has yielded over the history of the subject and continues to yield brilliant and fascinating philosophical responses and theories, all of which have something wrong with them. The attempt to escape the labyrinth by diagnosing them as pseudo-problems is also a failure. Philosophy is inescapable, and it should have at its core the study of these problems themselves, a study of their sources, what in our concepts and practices and beliefs generates these questions, and of both the positive virtues or appeal and the inadequacies of different and mutually opposed responses to them. And finally, the view is that by exploring these impossible problems and their sources, we can learn something about ourselves and our essentially problematic situation in the world, even as we fail to solve them. In this way, the process serves the function of philosophy as the most extreme form of self-consciousness. The problems that Barry devoted himself to in this way were multiple: epistemological skepticism, the a priori, realism versus subjectivism about value, secondary qualities, and modality, as well as problems about causality and perception. My own interests overlapped with his to some extent, but included other topics as well, such as free will, the mind-body problem, and the absurd. One has not really come to philosophical grips with these questions unless one finds them completely baffling. A rather small group of philosophers seem to us to engage with the subject in the same problem-centered way. Both of us found in our colleague Tom Clark an especially powerful example of this outlook, and it had an influence on us. Barry's writing was exceptionally pure, explicit, and unrhetorical. He had an exceptional gift for for bringing out and making clear the logical structure of complex arguments and counter-arguments, and for detecting unspoken assumptions behind philosophical positions. He was patient, charitable, and cogent in criticism. The care, thoroughness, and trenchancy of his work seems to me to be an expression of his personality more generally. In life, as in philosophy, he was intent on getting it right, on doing it as it should be done, and to a high standard. To put it negatively, he avoided any trace of sloppiness in his physical, personal, and mental life. All this was compatible with his being a hedonist, but one whose pleasures were richly informed by conscious attention. He knew how to enjoy life, and he was a wonderful friend. But there was a grim side to his outlook that was also part of his appeal, at least to me. He did not have high expectations of his fellow human beings, and was rarely surprised by manifestations of vanity, dishonesty, or selfishness, and he detected human failings of these kinds with merciless accuracy. He wasn't moralistic, but he was distinctly lacking in illusions, and the consistent encounter with his realism was always instructive. For all of us, there are a few people we feel particularly fortunate to have shared the world with. For me, Barry was one of these.
So I'd like to start by confessing that I'm still struggling even to believe the reason for which we're gathered here today. My dad was a person of such vigor, vitality, and vibrancy that it seems literally incredible that anything toppled him. I mean, I know all men are mortal, but Dad? It must have been one hell of a brain tumor to decide to take on that brain, not to mention body. My sisters and I have literally never experienced life without the power of the Barry force, as we call it, accompanying us. And with that force now extinguished and forever dissipated, we're all feeling somewhat unmoored. Perhaps you are too. Still, I'm happy to have the chance to mitigate the sadness by saying a few words about my dad. This is a welcome but tough assignment because my dad was remarkable in so many respects. I probably don't need to tell any of you here that my dad was in love with philosophy. It wasn't what he did for a living. It permeated all of him. Indeed, his so-called retirement in 2016 turned out to be only the occasion for more time to spend on doing more philosophy. Philosophical reflection was like food or water for him. He had to have some, more or less, every day. But perhaps on an even more fundamental level, living among books was like oxygen for him. If you doubt me, you should see his bookshelves at 672. Barry was, in the most literal sense, a person of the book. He dedicated his book on Hume to Sarah, book lover. But in my view, he was the real and the original book lover. Dad had flair and a distinctive kind of charm. He was naturally elegant, always well turned out. He was, if you'll permit the expression, couth. He was a great person to have dinner with and a wonderful travel companion. He was constantly attuned to the world. He noticed details and drew your attention to them. He was adept at charming cats. On the surface, though, it must be said that Dad had a kind of impassive or deadpan manner, which it was easy to find intimidating, especially if you didn't know him. Even if you did know him, it was sometimes hard to read him, to make out what he thought or what he was really trying to convey. Can I see some nods, please? My dad was, and the thing is, it really mattered to most people what Barry thought or what he was trying to convey. My dad was, and here I think you'll agree, a very authoritative person. He was an excellent judge of many things, so it was almost invariably very useful to know his opinion. Moreover, precisely because Barry was so admired and looked up to, it was natural to want very, very much to be one of the people that he, in turn, admired and valued. For all these reasons, Barry could very easily have swayed people in the directions that he favored or approved of. One of the most remarkable things about my dad, though, was that he so steadfastly refused to take advantage of, to avail himself of, that power to influence. My parents split up when I was 12 years old in the spring, and in the fall of that year I was turning 13, and my father came to visit us. He brought me presents for my 13th birthday, which, when unwrapped, turned out to be a stack of, I think, about 5 or 6 albums. These included, now regrettably, I did do some research for these remarks, but regrettably I have not been able to either remember or otherwise nail down the full set of these 5 or 6 albums. But I will give you a flavor of where this story is going by telling you that they included, so I can remember the following 2 pearls: Highway to Hell by AC/DC, and the debut, and so far as I only know, only album by The Knack, entitled Get the Knack, and featuring their one-hit wonder chart topper, My Sharona. Now, Wikipedia reminds me that there were actually some very good records that came out in 1979, some of which I actually own. So I'll just mention Regatta to Blanc by The Police, the B-52s, Fear of Music by Talking Heads, Candy-O by The Cars, and Ricky Lee Jones. However, I don't think, although I can't remember, that any of those actually good albums were in this group of 5 or 6 that my dad gave me. Clearly, my dad had done an unthinkable thing. He had walked into the now long defunct Tower Records on Durant, had walked up to some long-haired, stoned clerk and had asked him what 13-year-olds were listening to and would welcome as a birthday present. Need I say that this music would have been considered execrable by Barry had he ever been so unfortunate as to listen to any of these records? I think you see the point of my story. So, as I was saying, Dad did not often tip his hand, although he admitted to hating it when people did not pick their feet up when they walked. And he once opined in my presence that popcorn was, in his opinion, the lowest form of human eating. So I was saying that he did not often tip his hand, those remarks accepted. But in fact, though, it might have been more accurate to say that he often did not have a hand to tip. So I'll tell you another autobiographical story. When I finished graduate school and went out on the job market, I was fortunate enough to get 2 job offers for decent jobs in philosophy, of which obviously I had to choose only one. I experienced this decision in a way that's now puzzling to me as extremely difficult and agonized over it endlessly, constantly flip-flopping from one choice to the other. So I remember one day in particular, I had woken up full of new arguments that favored one of the options. And I was so eager to get Dad's opinion that I phoned him, knowing he's 3 hours earlier on the West Coast. I'm sure he was asleep when I called. And I gave him all of my new thoughts and arguments and eagerly said, "Dad, what do you think?" And he said, "It sounds as if you are now favoring McGill." That is a true story. While I confess that this was very frustrating to me for many years while he was alive, I now think it was one way in which Barry conveyed his absolute faith in those that he cared about to manage their own lives successfully. A final thing I want to underline about my dad, which I'm happy to see has been already anticipated in remarks by others, is that he was exceptionally good at devoting his life and energy to the things that really matter, or that mattered to him. When he thought something wasn't worth his time, he was remarkably, enviably good at not spending time on it. In his life, very little energy was expended on things that don't ultimately matter, like the internet, or worrying about your weight, or a careerist approach to philosophy. On the other hand, for things that did matter, or that mattered to him, Dad was all in. Philosophy, books, art, food, jazz, friendship, conversation, Italy, and earlier in his life, basketball and golf. Dad liked to go in depth on the things that mattered. When he decided something was worth his time, he gave it his full attention. He focused on it, and he did what was necessary to do it well. Anyone who is here today has probably felt the touch, in one way or another, of Barry's thinking that you were worth his time. And we have all been indelibly benefited by that. Sorry. That closes the first portion of today's proceedings. In a moment, I will invite all of you to proceed to Moses Hall for the dedication of the Stroud Room and a reception animated by further memories of Barry. But I would be remiss to do so before offering some thanks. First, on behalf of the whole Stroud family, I would like to thank the Berkeley Philosophy Department for wishing to memorialize and honor Barry in perpetuity in this very special way. Barry literally dedicated much of his life to the Berkeley Philosophy Department. And I think it was among the things that he loved the most. The surviving Strouds are profoundly touched, Niko and colleagues, by this moving demonstration of the degree to which the department reciprocates that sentiment. I would like to thank Niko Kolodny and Julie Stroud, ably assisted by Martha Stroud, for organizing, planning, and executing this wonderful event. Barry's memory has been beautifully served by these loving hands. I would like to thank Barry's former student, Tony Bizelko, for for generously offering up his expertise as a restaurateur to take charge of the catering of the reception that we are all about to enjoy. I would like to thank each person who spoke or performed here at Alumni House today. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you, colleagues, students, relatives, and friends of Barry's, for joining us today for this memorable gathering, which I hope has brought us all some comfort. Let's continue the conversation in Moses Hall. Thank you.